Good morning, my fellow caffeine addicts. Today, let's make sure I turn that volume down. Please excuse the iPad noises in the background. Today, I wanted to brew some coffee. Not just one, but two brew methods that we're going to go over. We're going to be doing, of course, the V60 with a new featured coffee, and it's May. It's starting to get hot. So we're also going to talk about, you guessed it, cold brew. In addition to that, after I make my coffee and I sit here and join you guys for a cup of coffee, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I approach starting a cafe, especially because that's been on my mind this past week. If you didn't know, Tespresso has taken over the operations over at the Toyota Cafe in Cedar Park, which is something that I'm really excited about. It's been a lot of fun. There's an amazing team over there right now, and it's exhausting. It's definitely exhausting, but we have lots of amazing things coming up. And the most important thing that I have to ask right now is, if you know anyone looking for a job, send them my way. All I care about is attitude and friendliness. Everything else I can train. If I have to untrain barista stuff, if you've been a barista before, I will untrain. I actually prefer zero experience. But yeah, let's get into that in a second. First, let's make some coffee. So, before we do anything else, I guess I should reintroduce this month's featured coffee. We are rocking the Peruvian Cafe, Soli Cafe, from the Soli Cafe Co-op by Super Thing, roasted by Super Thing here in Austin. Hopefully next weekend we will have them on, and we'll get to talk with Kyle, the owner, and he's going to tell us a little bit about how they've hired a champion roaster. He might have to correct me if I'm wrong on this. They've recently hired a champion roaster to help them dial in their roast process and make sure that it is absolutely competition grade coffee. So I'm really excited to hear what they've learned from that, even though it'll most likely go over my head. Roasting is not my forte. Maybe one day I'll start learning and exploring roasting, but I've got so much else on my plate right now. So this coffee is phenomenal. I end up tasting a lot of sweetness, which is something that I always look for when I'm trying a new coffee, as well as a hint of nuttiness. I like hazelnut is probably the best way to describe it for me. And yeah, so let's brew some. Sound good? Let me make sure I can see my comments, just in case. So I'm still working on finalizing a recipe, but for the time being, I've been doing a 1 to 12 ratio, 30 grams in, and about 2.5 minutes of extraction. And of course, shameless product plug, if you don't have a basket case yet, and you're using a normal burr grinder, I don't know if you've noticed that a lot of the coffees that I feature tend to have plenty of chaff, all that floating extra bits. Even if you're grinding coffee without chaff, I highly recommend getting one of these little sieve things. Yes, shameless plug. So what it does is it takes all the fines and the chaff and separates them from your target grind size, so that you end up with an even extraction. I should say more even extraction. Of course, if you don't have a burr grinder and you're still using a blade grinder, that is the first and most important upgrade you should get. I do need some coffee this morning. It's been a long week. We'll leave it at that. Oh, and I should have done this earlier. I apologize if you haven't received your coffee yet. I've been slowly shipping them out in batches throughout the week, unlike what I normally do, where I just ship them all out in one huge batch. And that's just because I haven't had time. I go to the cafe, hang out there, and then come back home exhausted, and try to crunch out as many shipments as I possibly can. So if you haven't gotten your coffee yet, please be patient with me. Email me if there's any issues with it. Call me, text me. I'll take care of you, I promise. Last thing I want is for you to go uncaffeinated for too long. All right, so of course we've We're doing this on the V60, the origami brewer there. Gorgeous piece of equipment. And so I've warmed everything up. I've rinsed the coffee filter. And we're going to weigh out our coffee. We're shooting for 30 grams. Weigh that out. Oh, looks like I need a little bit more. All right, 30.1 grams, perfect. I'm going to be using 88 degrees Celsius water, so if you let it boil, and then if you bring it to a full boil, and then you let it cool for like 3 minutes or so, you'll get around that point. Let's go ahead and tear that scale out and start the bloom. So for the bloom, we're going to go up to 60 grams of water. Making sure to get everything wet. That's the goal of the bloom, is to allow the coffee to soak in some water and get prepared for extraction and degas. So if you see bubbles in your bloom, that is a sign of freshness. That's a good thing. Also, make sure to smell it at this point. One of the other more prominent flavor notes in this particular coffee is caramel and apple. Like a caramel apple is very distinct. This is why I'm still working on the perfect recipe for this, because I can smell it and I know that it's in there somewhere, and I've only gotten hints of it in the tasting, so that means I need to fix something. But we're sticking with the tried and true recipe for today. So after about 30 seconds, we're going to start our pour. A 1 to 12 ratio. We started with 30 grams. 30 times 10 equals 300. 2 times 30 equals 60. So we're going up to 360 grams for our pour, and we're aiming for about 2.5 minutes. Ready, go. Nice, gentle circular motions with a slow drip. And that caramel just comes out right there. That slight acidity of the apple. Mwah. This is what I live for. This is what I do. Today we're going to do this in one continuous pour. We're going to go all the way up to 360, and then we're going to give it a gentle swirl so that the bed of coffee lays flat at the bottom of the filter. $362. I'm okay with that. So then we'll give it a gentle shake. Perfect. All right, so while that is brewing, let's go ahead and do the cold brew. So cold brew, unlike a V60, is incredibly forgiving. It's really easy, pretty straightforward. All you need, some kind of a vessel. I'm going to be brewing my cold brew in this. Some kind of a strainer. You can use a nut milk bag, which is my preferred method. You can also just use a paper filter, but that doesn't have to happen until tomorrow, so I don't even need that right now. So first things first, we're going to grind up some coffee. I go through coffee way too fast. Over here. Okay, so then once you have your ground coffee, and for cold brew, I shouldn't be saying this, but cold brew is the one brew method that it's okay to use a blade grinder. You don't need perfect even grind size for cold brew, simply because the amount of time that it will be brewing will ensure that everything that can be extracted will be extracted. So I'm going to weigh this out. We still do it gravimetrically because we're going to be doing a 1:4 ratio for a cold brew concentrate, or a 1:8 ratio if you want to have a ready to drink mix. So I'm going to be making a concentrate today. So I'm just going to go ahead and just dump that. Oh, sorry about that. Go ahead and just dump that in. And I've got us at 75 grams. 75 times 4, is that 600? 150, 300? 300. So now I'm going to add in 300 grams of water. You know what? I'm actually going to do a 1:6 ratio. So we'll go somewhere between a concentrate and a ready to drink. That way I can add in cream or milk and still be happy with it. So I'm going to go up to, what is that, 450? No, yeah. Math before coffee is not good. Okay, and that is literally all you have to do for amazing cold brew. I'm going to stir this up. I'm going to let it sit. And you can kind of see how it's already starting to degas. You can see that thin layer of bubbles up at the top there. I'm going to set that down and set a timer for 18 hours. You can go up to 24 hours for cold brew. Make sure to leave it at room temperature until after you strain it. If you put it in the fridge, that'll slow down the entire process and you'll need closer to 36 hours, which is fine. Just let it sit in your fridge longer, but I prefer set it out at room temperature, seal it, and then 18 hours later, strain it through a nut milk bag, take the resulting concentrate, throw that in the fridge, and it's good for up to 7 days, 7 to 10 days. All right, so timer, 18 hours. Start. Perfect. So tomorrow morning, I will have some amazing cold brew. I'm looking forward to starting my day with that. Now, one other thing to note about cold brew, and cold brew gets a lot of grief in the industry because the compounds that are extractable in a hot versus cold brew, the difference between the types of flavors you get in the coffee is mostly dependent on which compounds within the coffee are that break apart under heat. So like if you're doing a hot brew coffee, you're going to be getting all of the compounds that come out under heat as well as all the compounds that come out without heat. Whereas cold brew, you're going to be getting only the compounds that come out at a room temperature. I'm not a scientist. Hopefully that makes sense. But there is a difference in the chemical composition of cold brew versus hot coffee. Now, one of the good things, which I think is a pro for cold brew, is that because it's only extracting things that are able to be extracted at room temperature, that means that it's a stable chemical compound for that temperature. Whereas if you have hot brew, if you've ever brewed hot coffee and then let it sit for a couple of hours, it ends up tasting awful because those compounds that existed under heat, or that were able to be extracted under heat, break apart and reform as the temperature changes. And so you end up with this kind of stale, old, musty tasting coffee. All right. So there you go. If you have any questions about cold brew, I am here. One of my claims to fame is that I was this is always a weird thing to brag about, but I am ridiculously proud of it. The cafe that I owned in Beijing, China was the first cafe to offer nitro cold brew in the entirety of China. And that's what put us on the map. Like, we were a tiny nobody little cafe, and then once we did that, people came from all over to come check us out. And it was a lot of fun. I still remember the day that I was I was like calling up all these different factories and being like, hey, do you guys have nitrogen? Do you guys have nitrogen? And every single one of them was like, what do you mean nitrogen? Why would we have that for you? And like after like 2 days of calling and calling and calling, finally one factory out in the middle of nowhere, like 2 hours away, hour and a half away, in the outskirts of Beijing, in this like Bodunk part of the manufacturing centers. They were like, yeah, no, I think we have some nitrogen. Why don't you come on out? So I drove my little electric motorcycle out there, Barely had enough battery to get back, but when I got there, it was like dusk, and this guy like led me into this like dirt basement that was just filled with gas canisters, like these giant 2 liter, 5 liter, 10 liter gas canisters. And he's like, "All right, here's our nitrogen." And luckily, it was pure nitrogen, which is preferable for nitro cold brew over like beer gas, which is I think 70% nitrogen and 30% CO2. Beer gas will nitrogenate and carbon dioxide. Beer gas will make it taste funny. And pure nitrogen will not impact the taste. It will only impact the mouthfeel. All right. I'm going to pour myself some coffee in this nice little snifter glass. Oof. Oof. See? Right there. Just that first little whiff. I'm just like, that is green apple. Like straight up. I love it when you have that X factor that just jumps out at you. Delicious. Phenomenal. All right, so talking about cafe stuff. So I know it's a dream of many people to open up a cafe. And in fact, I got started in the coffee industry by telling my wife not to open a cafe. She had been studying under a champion barista at that point in time. And it was her dream to open up a little cafe and, hang out with people. And as I was analyzing the cafe business, I was like, this is a terrible idea. Cafes are almost never successful. They're usually kind of the pipe dream of a mom and pop shop situation. You have to have brand recognition and volume, and it's much more about like a real estate location for successful cafes. Like if they pick the right spot and they have the operations and they have the brand recognition set up, sure, you can do high volume with good margin items. But if you don't have that, then you're going to do low volume with moderate margin items, and you end up going bust pretty quickly. Like you might have fun, you might be able to have your little atmosphere and serve your friends and kind of hang out, and that is kind of the attractive element of running a cafe. But in my experience, inevitably, if you start that way, sure, great, you can set up the atmosphere, you're having fun, and then you start to realize that the numbers aren't working and you're overworking yourself and your staff trying to juggle that, and that stress comes into play and it totally ruins the entire atmosphere that you're looking for, or that got you into it in the first place. And so having a plan, having an approach to mitigating that and managing that, I think is critical for running a cafe. And so luckily, I've had plenty of experience with setting that up and fixing cafes and changing their setup, and that's kind of how I got involved with this Toyota thing. Granted, I haven't been doing this for the past like 2 or 3 years. I'm always happy to sit down and chat, and I have chatted with people, but I haven't done the consulting side of things where I actually go in and fix up a cafe. So I am beat up. It's been, whole pandemic thing, sitting around doing little to nothing every day. All of a sudden, I'm back on my feet for 6, 7, 8 hours a day, with no rest, and just like cleaning and organizing and figuring out how to order things and how to price things and getting to know people's names and their orders and their drinks, and it's mentally and physically exhausting and emotionally exhausting. But I'm here for it. I love it. I didn't even realize how much I missed it. In fact, just yesterday, God, it feels like so long ago. Just yesterday, it was the kind of situation where I was alone in the cafe, getting ready to close. It was 3 hours at the end of the day. Usually the last 3 hours in the cafe they're pretty slow. People don't have all that much coffee in the afternoon. But yesterday, that was not the case. Yesterday, we had, the morning hours, we did the same amount of volume in the last 3 hours as we did during the entire morning. So from 7 a.m. until 2 p.m., we did X amount of volume. And then from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m., we did that same amount of volume. And it was me alone by myself. And so it was constantly juggling between taking people's orders, writing names on cups, cleaning up all the stations, all the workstations, brewing all the coffee. And it was exhilarating. Like I love that. And if you're the kind of person who enjoys service industry stuff, like, you get it. If you don't, I totally understand. It's stressful and exhausting, but when you get through it and you're like, nailed it, hit all those points, made everybody happy, that's what you live for. All right, so me, cafes, nonsense, and again, I'm spewing nonsense as I usually do. So for me, the essence of a cafe is service, right? You are here to serve people what they need to either start their day or get a little pick-me-up throughout the day. But it's not simply the product. But the product here does have to be phenomenal, but it is the engagement with those people. Like, you don't want to go to you go through a drive-through, you grab your coffee, and you're on your way. And to some extent, that's good for some people that are in a rush. And so in a cafe, you have to be able to judge, what does this person want? You have to quickly make a snap decision. This person walks up, do they just need a quick hit of caffeine and to be on their way? Or are they looking to interact with the brand? I hate these kind of buzzwords around this, but get that engagement. And oftentimes, in my experience, it is even just the little things about opening up the conversation, breaking the ice with somebody, saying something silly, saying something funny, throwing them off their guard, and those experiences allow for the delight in a customer that drives the return. So every cafe is fueled by its regular customers. You cannot have a cafe that is based on just volume where it changes every single day, the people who come through every single day. I guess I shouldn't say you cannot, they exist. But if you are opening your own cafe and doing that, that's not what you're going to survive on. You're not going to survive on volume, you're not going to survive on having the right location. Those locations have already been taken by the large chain stores. And even if you were to take the location of a large chain store, you wouldn't have the brand recognition. People would go out of their way. The people who are consuming coffee through drive-through like situations will go out of their way to find a different location than your location. The people who are seeking out mom and pop shops or going to local places, they are looking for that experience, that engagement. Part of that has to be a phenomenal product. The other part of it has to be going beyond the product, breaking the ice, having the conversations. So how does that happen? How does that exist? That only exists when you have staff that A, know what they're talking about, and B, are friendly and can hold conversations with people. And the only way that your staff can be there is if all of the operations are smooth and controlled and reliable. And that is where most cafes falter. So what I see play out over and over again in most cafes is you start with this idea of like, I want to have this beautiful space where people can hang out and, like, my friends can come and we've got this space to exist in, and there's going to be delicious coffee and amazing pastries, and we can all have these relaxed conversations. And it starts off that way, but then you recognize that the numbers are not adding up and it's not working out, and you need more volume or more margin or whatever it is. And so that anxiety and that stress pushes you towards changing your model and changing the experience. And very quickly, the people who enjoyed the atmosphere before move away. They move on. They say, hey, you know what? This is not for me anymore. And so you're changing and shifting your entire customer base. And that is what drives your existence. So making that transition is nigh impossible. So for me, when it comes to operations, things that I look at are, how often are you ordering? How often are you restocking? How focused on the initial impression of the cafe are you? When I come to a cafe, when I walk into any cafe, this is occupational hazard. I do this with every cafe unwittingly. I can't help myself. But the first things that I do is I walk in and I look for a couple of things. First, I say, line of sight. Are there any direct messes, like a coffee pot left out on a counter, a rag carelessly strewn somewhere, a milk steamer that's been left out, a stack of like cookies that are supposed to go into the cookie display thing? Are there any messes that I can see as a customer? So that line of sight behind the bar is incredibly important. Even if you subconsciously, any customer that comes in messes will subconsciously affect their first impression of what this cafe is like. Second thing that I look for are industry-specific things. So if you have an espresso machine, first of all, what kind of espresso machine is it? Is it a commercial-grade espresso machine, or is it like a prosumer, barely good enough for home use kind of espresso machine? If it is a professional quality machine, I immediately look at the steam wand. If that steam wand is clean and shining, I'm like, okay, good, we can actually try the coffee. If there's any visible milk crust on there, then I immediately know that the baristas have not been trained in how to maintain an espresso machine. And if it's not maintained well, grime and dust and gunk will build up on not just the steam wand, but inside the group heads, and that will affect the taste of the coffee. And I'm not gonna drink that coffee. The next thing that I do is I immediately go to the counter, and I feel like an asshole when I do this, but I do it every time. I order 2 to 3 drinks. I'll always order a straight espresso shot because that will be indicative of the level of training the barista has, the level of quality with the beans that they're sourcing, and just the general base of all the other drinks that they're going to be making. The next thing I'll order is either a cappuccino or an iced Americano. So cappuccino has a wide variety of interpretations, right? So if I simply go up and I order a cappuccino, most cafes have a standard. They have their own standard for what a cappuccino is. And that standard can be wildly different. So when I'm most pleasantly surprised is when someone behind the counter, the barista, is knowledgeable enough to say, hey, what do you mean by cappuccino? Or what kind of a cappuccino would you like? Or do you want a traditional cappuccino, a modern cappuccino, or a dry cappuccino? Those are the 3 general definitions. So for your information, just so you know, a traditional cappuccino is an 8-ounce drink. It's just espresso and steamed milk with a good amount of foam. But again, we're looking for that microfoam. A modern cappuccino is what most cafes serve these days. So it's going to be a 12-ounce drink, otherwise the exact same as the traditional cappuccino. A dry cappuccino is a vestige from an older era that the advent of large chain stores like Starbucks has bastardized a traditional cappuccino. And that is a 12-ounce drink that is half just super thick burnt milk foam, and then half espresso and a little bit of a tiny amount of steamed milk. If you like that, hey, that's your thing, that's your drink. But that's an old era in the past 10 years where that particular drink was bastardized into an American version of a cappuccino called a dry cappuccino. And so, and then iced Americanos. Iced Americanos they require, so if you have a straight espresso, it requires some fine tuning, and it requires one person to come in and, at least one person, to come in and dial in the espresso and create a recipe for each different coffee that you have. But an iced Americano requires the actual barista of that day to play with the espresso recipe enough that it can mix well with water and temperature. And that is, an iced Americano is actually surprisingly difficult to pull off well. Even I can admit that I don't pull them off every single time. They're that difficult. So those are the 3 drinks that I generally pull from, and each one of them will tell me something about how well that cafe is run in terms of its coffee quality. The last thing that I look at is how many people do they have waiting in line. So there's a nice, depending on the size of the cafe and the volume that's to be expected, there's a nice, what do you call it, a golden spot, sweet spot. Slowly getting my coffee up. There's a nice sweet spot of the right number of people. If you have too few people waiting in line, then it is unappealing to your average customer. If you have too many people, then maybe it's appealing, but the idea of waiting too long is unappealing. If you have, generally speaking, 5-ish people in line, then you're like, hey, this place is good enough to have a constant line of people that trust the coffee and the process here. I don't mind waiting 5 minutes, 10 minutes for something of that quality. I'll stand in line too. And so you slowly build up this, it's a marketing gimmick in any restaurant, Franklin's Barbecue does this incredibly well, where they have this huge long line out the door, and they limit their supply. It's not, in coffee, it's not about limiting the supply, it is about it's kind of about hyping it up, right? It's getting those people to say, hey, this is worth waiting for. And then also I look at, does the barista behind the counter recognize any of the people who are in line? Do they chat? Do they talk? Does the barista already know their order before they get there? And if so, that means that they have that rapport. They've built that up. They've had enough leisure time in the operations. They're not constantly struggling to keep up with everything, just bam, 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 bam. But they have enough leisure time to build up a rapport and a relationship with their customers. And the ownership of the cafe encourages that. All of these are the good signs that I look for in a cafe. All right. So how do you, as a cafe owner, how do you encourage that? How do you set that up? You make sure that that all of your systems in place for ordering, for preparation, for opening, for closing, for maintenance, that you have all those written down. Sure, SOPs, great, easy. But also that you have enough staff to manage that. It is common in the restaurant industry. And I blame this on tipping culture and how that's been twisted and turned around for the entirety of the US, where tipping culture encourages running businesses by paying wages that don't support people. Anyways, that's a different conversation. But the focus for running your cafe should always be on your staff first. If you're able to support your staff and provide them with the systems and the setup and the wages that they need in order to not have stress about work environment or life, then they will have the leisure time to build a rapport with each of your different regulars. And those people will tell more people, and they will keep coming back every day. If you sell one $5 cup of coffee, that doesn't matter. Nobody cares about one $5 transaction in a cafe. If you have one person who comes and spends $5 every single day, that person is a regular, and that person is a valued customer because they like and trust what you're doing, and they're going to tell other people, and they're going to provide you with continuous revenue, all of which are critical. Okay, I lose my mind talking about these things, and I just go off on tangents over and over again. But yes, that's the idea behind running a cafe, is that it's going to be staff-centric first, play the support role as the owner to make sure that your staff, your team, your people have the opportunity to engage customers that want to be engaged, and that they have the right talking points to tell stories about the coffee. This is all I do all the time, is I talk about the different coffees that I pick, and I engage with those brands, and I learn about what they're doing and the cool things that they have going on and what they have planned. And I genuinely get excited about it because it means that A, I get to try amazing coffee, and B, I have something to share with people when I'm talking about coffee with them. And for me, that's kind of like, this is not business stuff. This is just me personally loving coffee and enjoying spreading the word and helping people understand coffee a little bit more. Requires that level of trust and engagement, just chatting. Okay, I'm gonna get off of my soapbox. I'm so sorry that you listened to this. But hey, stay caffeinated, and I'll catch you guys next week. Bye.